Hello everyone and welcome to the virtual series with ACS. My name is Catherine Newington and I will be your host. We are up to webinar number 2 and we are looking at utilising technology for remote learning. I actually have a co-host with me today. It's Gregory, who also works for ACS. And he has got a lot of experience and knowledge around using online learning, so he will be a great asset for our webinar today. What we're going to be looking at today, so here's just a quick rundown. So the focus for this webinar today is looking at pedagogy and why pedagogy is really important when we're looking at technology. So we're looking at it from pedagogy before technology. That's going to be my motto for today. Then we're also going to dive into and look at the difference between synchronous and asynchronous learning and understanding why that's really important for our learners. Then we're going to do some more deep diving into different styles of learning. So we're looking at project-based learning, Bloom's taxonomy, and solo taxonomy as well. At the very end of today, we're going to have some question time. Please feel free to pop into the chat any questions that you might have over the course of the webinar. Sometimes I kind of want to think of a really good question to start with and then kind of forget it by the time that question time comes around. If you are looking to ask a specific question to either myself or Phil, just pop our names in before, so then ask a Catherine or a Phil question. If it's a generalised question and you don't mind whoever answers it, then that's no problem at all. So if you're not already aware that ACS has an ICT educator community where I work with a lot of teachers from the foundation all the way up to year 10 and helping and support teachers with the digital technologies curriculum, as well as supporting teachers with technology and utilising technology for learning purposes. Write this email address down and come and join our community. It's free to join and we have over 100 resources available to support all your learning needs within this space. We also have a dedicated forum where I'm hoping that I can support you even further after this webinar has finished. So starting off is, why are we looking at pedagogy and why is that really important and a fundamental part of when we're utilising technology? What we have to do is we have to think about ourselves as teachers and educators and think about the style that we want to present to our learners. That reflecting and knowing about our pedagogy enables us to pick the right type of technology as a tool to support our learners. And that's why we're focusing purely on pedagogy. We're not going to be looking at different styles of technology, different software, because at the end of the day, we need to be able to ensure that the pedagogy and the technology marries together. What we don't want to do is have all of this technology and we have to adapt our learners and ourselves as educators to make sure that technology works. That's not how it works. It's all about putting ourselves first and putting our learners first and finding the right tool to engage our learners. So now we're going to be looking at and distinguishing the difference between synchronous and asynchronous learning. Right. So synchronous learning, imagine it's kind of like a little bit of live learning. So it's kind of like that face-to-face learning, but imagine it's completed in an online area. So the students then are accessing the material live with the teacher. All the resources are pushed out when the session is happening live. The learning is completed with the teacher as well. The biggest implication that we have around synchronous learning is the inequality for those who don't have good internet connection and also don't actually have access to any digital technology. A lot of you might be utilising synchronous learning when you're doing maybe some Zoom calls or you're using Compass or Microsoft Teams as a way to interact and communicate with your learners. The second style that we have is asynchronous learning. We dove a little bit into this last week in our webinar number 1. So it's all about self-paced learning. So you're not actually live with the teacher or the educator. All of the resources are all kind of in a bank ready to go. It's accessed by the student at any time and anywhere. So it could be online or it also could be as a hard copy. I know a lot of teachers who, especially in those junior levels at the moment, where it's just not possible for our smaller students who can't access the technology. So what they're doing is they're creating hard copy resources and teaching for that week and then passing it on to their students that way. That's still asynchronous learning. It's just not happening with technology. So I always like to think of asynchronous learning as a Netflix style of learning where you've got all of that information available for you and that the students kind of just use it when they need to. I'm sure a lot of us have been doing some binge watching with Netflix or a streaming style of movies and some TV shows as well. So the resources that we can push out to our students can be multi-molded. What that means is that it can be a range of videos. It doesn't just have to be text-based. It could be getting them to listen to some podcasts as well. So digital technologies can really come in handy and those type of resources when you are working with asynchronous learning. To give you a better idea of what they look like, I've just created this slide, so it's really that side-by-side information. Now, not one is better than the other. So you could use either or. So again, we'll go through it. It's live teaching with the teachers and students together, or a student and teacher are working separately. In synchronous learning, we have that the teacher is the driver of the learning, or we've got asynchronous, where the student is responsible for organising their own learning. Content can be pushed out within the synchronous style, and it's live between the student and the teacher. Or the asynchronous style is that all content is available to the student and they work through it themselves. Majority of learning with a synchronous style of learning is completed through that active live session. Or we've got asynchronous, where the learning resources are all available for the student and they can pick and choose which one suits them the best. Understanding the difference between synchronous and asynchronous learning is vital for you as educators. It allows you to be able to differentiate between how the content can be delivered to your students. And it's also about making sure that you understand and can validate why you're doing it a certain way. Home life at the moment can be completely disrupted with everyone. So that synchronous style of learning may not be appropriate for some of your learners. And that's something at the moment that we have to keep into consideration. The context as well enables you to be able to cater the learning and the delivery of the resources to cater for your students. So that's why it's really important for you to understand the difference between synchronous and asynchronous learning. I bet you've already started thinking about how you're utilising one or the other. Why it's also then important is that I want us now to have a little bit of reflection about what we're already doing when it does come to learning online. If you are a synchronous teacher and you are using that mode, how often are you delivering these lessons? But most importantly, how long are you actually talking for? What I've found is a lot of teachers at the moment, when it comes to asynchronous learning, is they're going backwards to the lecture style based teaching and spending a lot more time talking and not providing our students with the time to do. If that's your case, start timing yourself. Because remember, even though that lesson may go for 45 minutes or even an hour, you don't have to talk that long. In this respect, the use of digital technologies is putting us back into lecture style based teaching, and that's not what we want. If you're using asynchronous learning style, how are you providing support to your students? How are they completing tasks within a set time frame? Are you still having the opportunity to check in on them? And how often are you checking in on them? And is that enough time for your students as well? What type of materials are you providing with your students as well? Are you relying on the text-based style of resources, or are you providing them with different styles as well? As we talked about, podcasts, we've also got videos. There's so many other learning resources and materials that we can provide for our students. Are you relying on one mode more than the other? Have you considered the other mode as well? And is there room for you to try something new? I know that we are also going back into our classes, or a lot of our classes have already gone back to face-to-face teaching. What we're talking about doesn't actually just apply to teaching remotely. What I want you to think about and consider is what you've done over the last couple of weeks and possibly months. How can you bring that back into the classroom and continue to use some of these learning styles back into the classroom? You might find that that asynchronous style of learning has worked really well. You've got access to a platform that you may have never used before. So you might be able to want to use that platform again. You could have that platform, but use it as an asynchronous style as well. That could be a platform where you start to put all of that information and content and material for your learners as well. Now we're going to look into the pedagogy again, but looking at project-based learning. So project-based learning is all about students exploring real-life challenges and problems. It's taking what they know as well and the assessment and incorporating multiple areas of the curriculum and subjects in one broad project. So rather than siloing your mathematics or your science, you're providing them an opportunity to see how each of those subject areas integrate with one another. That then leads to deep learning. So rather than just learning a skill, they actually learn the application of that skill. It also then provides a platform for them to be doing purposeful learning. I don't know how many times as a teacher I heard the, but why are we learning this? Project-based learning allows you to answer that but why question. It's also student-driven, and it's also then keeping track of their learning as they're going. The reason why I mention project-based learning is because I think there's a real correlation between project-based learning and asynchronous learning. There's a little bit of similarities between them, and that's why I wanted to bring both of them up. One of the biggest issues is when we are trying to track our students' learning and keeping our students on task and when they're taking ownership of their learning. I wanted to share with you a graphic organizer that I have used in the classroom, and it's been super successful with all of my learners. And this is a staircase style graphic organizer. And if you can draw a rectangle, you can make one of these in the classroom. So we actually have, you can see that with this particular one, we've got a couple of different rectangles, and they create a staircase. The idea is that each of the activities that the students do is represented in each of the rectangles. And as the student then moves up through it, so we start at the bottom and then we move slowly up within it, and each row represents an activity that the student has to do. As they move up through the project, they have to then check in with their teacher. This then ensures that when they're checking in, that we're not just looking at the end product. As educators, each time we're checking in, we're ensuring that the standard of the work is the quality at what we want it. We're also ensuring that they're moving along with the project, that giving students, regardless of how old they are, one big project can actually be quite daunting for them. And so it then just, it makes it down into more micro-manageable tasks for our students. As they move up and then they reach the top, the project is finished. So why is something like this really good to use? I thought about it, and it's a really great way to manage learning. If you're using asynchronous learning, then this could be a really great graphic organizer for you to take away and try it with your students as well. It's not just about using technology, but it's about them managing their learning as they're using technology for the remote learning. It's a visible tool to track their learning, which then keeps them on track. And they will also see what's coming next. So they see that there's a purpose to the activity that they're doing. So it's that big picture put down into micro little bits. It's a self-paced activity as well. And don't forget, and when I talk about self-paced, I'm not saying that they have forever to do it. What I mean is that they can work through and take as much time or as little time as they need. But don't forget, you as the educator will be there in the background supporting them when they go through each of those steps, and thinking and remembering that you won't allow them to go to the next step until they've finished that current activity. It's a completely adaptable graphic organizer. I've used it with younger year levels in a grade 1-2 class, and I've managed their learning. So I've kind of then created it, and I filled in each of the steps with my students. They absolutely love stickers, so of course, so we had hard copies, and every single time an activity was finished, they got that gold star. Do you know how many stars I had to hand out that day and all of when we were doing that project? But they love to have that little bit of motivation to see what star you were up against as well. It wasn't about competition of who had the more stars. It just they just loved the fact that they got a gold star when they had finished an activity. When it came to working in a higher year level, I actually got the students to manage their own learning. I gave them the big project, and together they actually worked out what activity was needed in each of those steps. It was a perfect example of the students driving their own learning. I knew that I was on something really important and valuable for the students, is that we went into the classroom, and I always call it organized chaos. And what it meant is that every single student had their staircase organizer with them, and they were working on different projects at different times. I would go around to each of the students and continue just to check in to make sure that they were on track. The comment that I would say to them is, what are you doing? What work are you up to? And we would have a conversation about that as well. I'd do a little bit of a signature and a tick, and then that activity was up and running again. What I loved is that when we were doing this type of learning and using that graphic organizer, is as soon as the bell would go, I would then have kids going, oh, it was so lovely to see them that they were engaged in their learning, that they had taken full ownership of it, but they were able to manage and track their learning themselves. That's, as I said before, that type of graphic organizer would be extremely valuable if you're ever doing any project-based learning, or you're using digital technologies in an asynchronous learning environment. So now we come up to the next part of it. And so I want to introduce Phil now and talk about, Phil, is that why we use pedagogical frameworks like Bloom's and Solo taxonomy to assess how the students are going when we're learning online.
Well, look, thanks, Catherine. I just love that engagement and the way in which, we're sort of slowly building up steps and creating a situation where we can see different elements of our learning and build a bigger framework picture. So I guess the short answer that I'd have for what is pedagogy and how it applies is the classic, it's scaffolding, right? So it's all about that zone of proximal development that all the teachers out there will know exactly what I'm talking about, but moving to a virtual, if you like, a zone of virtual development, right? So something about where the more knowledgeable other becomes a virtual networked knowledgeable other. Okay, so that's getting a little bit kind of technical language, isn't it? But it doesn't really seem to matter. Our students still need a structured and insightful development process of learning, don't they? I mean, if they're going to achieve the outcomes we want for them, then we really need better sight and oversight and focus. So it's no different in online and blended learning. It's, in a way, it's the similarities are there. It's just what we've got is a virtual environment that we're looking into instead of a physical environment. So that process, for it to be authentic, accessible and effective, we really need to engage in that step-by-step process that you're talking about, something that we can really get involved in. So, look, my go-to guy with all of this still is Lev Vygotsky. So if you hear me kind of talking about embedding learning and how learning sits inside the society, then just please just tell me to move on. But look, in a slightly enlarged virtual zone, it's an easier way for us to get access to a whole edifice of learning while building a kind of better understanding for our students, who are busy and noisy. So I'm like you, Catherine. I just love a really noisy, busy classroom. So pedagogy should kind of allow us to know exactly where each student is in the process of their knowledge construction, be able to measure the work that's done so far, and give guidance to each on how to achieve their learning objectives. That's what it should be all about, right? So it shouldn't be a matter of whether they're just junior electricians or kindergarten plumbers or primary school architects or secondary building inspectors. It should be transparent to everyone involved. So before I go on to kind of have a look bit more about, I just want to remind us a bit about what that structure looks like in the cognitive sense, and just to talk about the way in which both Anderson and Crutwell they revised the Bloom's cognitive framework, so that the idea was that what they were trying to do was make cognitive processes, turn them into verbs, and then by doing that, you instantly imply an object. And in this case, the object, of course, is of the cognitive activity is knowledge. So, but what a lot of us probably, kind of forgotten about, or is not part of what we, have done in these terms, is we've probably forgotten about how we map that onto the domains of knowledge. So, just quickly having a look at some of the activities here in terms of what remembering looks like for factual knowledge, what it looks like for conceptual knowledge, and if some of you want to kind of expand the graphic here to get a better idea of it, then please do so. If we move on and have a look at what it looks like for, say, remembering procedural knowledge, there's a range of things here. If you want to understand procedural knowledge, then you're involved in a predictive activity. If you're applying it, then you're calculating, etc. So similarly, conceptual knowledge deals with classifications. We know that. So you might say, for example, Phil's remembering all the elements of Bloom's taxonomy because he can describe them, but he hasn't been able to explain them that well. So he probably needs to do a bit more work on the understanding, applying and analysing of them, if you like. So if we just look at it, using your staircase model, Catherine, I think in a lot of ways, there's all of these elements that we all, and we're all pretty familiar with, but there's also, a bunch of words or verbs, I think, that we can very easily and nicely put together in terms of, if you like, the inside of the IT space, when we're actually looking at and thinking about things like, for example, if we're remembering this kind of knowledge, what does it look like in terms of the activities? Well, some of the activities you'd be thinking about here are bookmarking, copying, highlighting, searching. If you're looking for activities that are relevant to understanding, then journaling, tweeting, tagging, subscribing. If you're looking at ways at looking at how are your students applying their knowledge, then you'd see calculation, you'd see charting, you'd see editing, you'd see uploading, etc. So I don't want to go into all of these, but this construction here will sit there, and you can have a look at it later. But look, there's one other thing that I think we need to add here, and that is that if we're going to add this other dimension, what's it going to look like? Does it stack up and fit into Bloom's? Well, I think we can add it, and I think we can call it networking. So apart from, and once we get to the point where they're involved and engaged in the creative activities, then the next thing they need to do is actually, if you like, share it and network it and connect. So what does that look like? Well, the mere fact of networking your knowledge to other people is really important. Sharing other knowledge becomes a premium because these days you have to actually be actively involved in sharing. It's part of what we need to do as learners now. If we're going to be lifelong learners, we need to learn how to share. We need to learn how to connect. We need to be able to construct knowledge in a way that's creative, understanding, and builds on other knowledge in a constructive and cooperative fashion. So Wiking's a really good example of it. Now, you mentioned a bit earlier the solo taxonomy, and I think it's really appropriate because I think these days a lot of us have a familiarity with solo and have used solo. It's in a lot of ways it's a lot more accessible because what it does is it actually brings the if you like the level of complexity into the model, but it also delivers a form of explanation in terms of how we build up complexity and an understanding complexity with our students. So it's kind of like it's a very easy, easier model to use, and it's kind of in some ways more dynamic. And in that regard, I think it's in terms of online learning and in terms of feedback, it creates a nice structure that's easy for rubrics. It's easier to develop a conversation with students online using that particular rubric. For example, if you have a look at this, if we want to actually apply this right now, we could put together a small rubric, for example, on what's a teacher's our own self-assessment of our ICT use in a school. If we start here at the pre-structural level, we're basically asking around how do I get help? How do I make a contribution? And then if we go to the first single kind of notion and idea, we're talking about how do I use a particular tool? Yeah, and is there room for something new? If we go to a more multi-structural kind of a response in terms of our interaction and our discussion about this subject, what IC tools are in the school, how do we understand all of their capabilities? So you can see this as we go up through, we can assess our own activities quite easily in the ICT space. And it's good to be able to do this. It's a great way to practice how we interact with our students on the same level. So having seen that this particular, the sort of power of the solo thing, what I just want to introduce now, just as a, as a tool here for everyone out there, is that, there's more than one of these taxonomies that were developed out of the Bloom consultation process. Because it's not just about Bloom, because Bloom was a whole bunch of people together who, it's been slowly evolving. The effective one's probably, it's the domain that's least understood. It didn't win any of the popularity contests because it wasn't trendy and cognitive. But these days, we're in a situation where we need to reach out to people and understand the context in which they're learning. It seems to me that now's the time for us to be thinking about use of the affective domain. And so I'd just like to spend a little bit of time on that, if you don't mind, and just kind of talk about it, about the structure of it, because what it does is it gets back to that Vygotsky stuff about placing people in their environment and their connection with their own learning. So the levels of it: receiving, responding, valuing the concepts, organising and putting them into a priority kind of framework for yourself, and then characterising them, meaning that you've kind of absorbed them inside of a total understanding. You're able to operate with them effectively. And this is a really important thing because it engages the learner in a real context. It certainly in the way in which I see it. So if you like, it's moving from a kind of instrumental way in which we're looking at how they're actually engaging with the learning through to, if you like, a higher level metacognitive one. But let's just go through perhaps some of the steps, and we'll just see how they might fit in with ICT. So when we start talking about receiving, what we're talking about is, are you open to the experience, of the knowledge? Are you actually motivated and connected to it? And at this point in time, we'd really be seeing students, logging on, getting themselves involved, registering for the various things they need to be doing. But they also need to kind of demonstrate at this point that they actually have a motivation for being there, that they want to learn. There's some kind of positive thing about it. Then, responding. Well, a response, really means that they're actually starting to involve, and they're starting to socialise and create groups. If you're not responding, for example, you might put a message on your email thing saying, "Sorry, I'm away. I'm not available to have a chat," or whatever. The important thing there is that responding, it's part of the critical interaction that takes place when the spirit of inquiry has been developing. That means that they've started to volunteer or actually start involved in discussion groups, for example, or discussion forums. That they're willing and able to get involved in presentations, online presentations, etc., and that they're starting to be seen, about. Now, in terms of valuing, well, this is where they're starting to demonstrate how they value an idea. So, and then they're actually engaged with the idea, and they're debating it, they're defending it, and they've got to a point where they've become involved in the idea for themselves, and they're starting to place it into their universe, and that's really important for learning. I think we'd all agree as teachers that we need to see that these ideas aren't just abstractly being understood and cognitively processed in the right way, but that they're actually lodging somewhere and being appreciated in a positive way. And that's a really important way, I think, in terms of us assessing the level at which the students have become involved. And then there's the organising of the ideas, where they start to establish their own online identity. And this may be different from their classroom identity, by the way. I mean, it's interesting that at this point in time there may be various ways which you see some sides of the student that you've never seen before, and they may associate with different kinds of community which you haven't seen before. They may exhibit different learning styles, that kind of thing. And it's really important at this stage that we really try to give them as much support. And let's be prepared and be surprised about the way in which they're going to interact and the level of their creativity. It's a really exciting part of the learning process from my point of view. Then, of course, there is, the most important stage. And that's where, the ideas are lodging with us, and they've become part of the student's world. And so you'll see them making unsolicited contributions. They'll be adding into the group. And this is where, a lot of the different domains all come together, and they start bringing focus and encouraging others. And this is where you really see some of the, exciting elements of where they can start to think about more broadly. But also, this is also the stage where you're going to see, the potential for critical thinking. And you should try and sort of build in at that point in time some kind of reviewing mechanism, so that you and the rest of the students that are involved in the group can all benefit from it. And we start that important feedback loop. And then, of course, there's the networking aspect, that I keep throwing in here on top of everything else. And what that's really about is just to try and see how we can put both of these things together, how we can put this cognitive domain and understand and see how they're processing their ideas and applying them, and understanding, applying, analysing them properly, evaluating their value and all the rest of it. But that each one of these other steps in terms of the way in which they're connected with the ideas is also happening at the same time, particularly where, as teachers, we're going to be a little bit anxious, right? A little bit anxious about the fact that they're sitting out there in these remote situations, and how are we going to engage with them emotionally? Because most of us as teachers, we're very good observers of people. We're very good at understanding the way in which people interact with each other. And we pick up a lot of stuff in non-verbal languages. And what we don't do is kind of, if you like, really have a structure for that. And I think what the wonderful thing is about this particular domain, the affective domain, is that it does give us some language to talk about that and to see a way in which they've been progressing through the different levels. And I really recommend to you that in this point in time where you are engaging in online learning, and some of us have, it's quite a challenge, it's quite difficult, it's not easy to do that. I've had teachers, friends of mine, saying, oh my God, it's all too much, I just find it so difficult. But if you've got some of this kind of step-by-step approaches, which, Catherine laid out very nicely a bit earlier, I think it would really help with some of the language and some of the way in which we're engaging. I've kind of run fairly quickly through a lot of this stuff, but there's a couple of, quite, I think some really important questions that, I'd really love us to be thinking about. I'd like to also just tie together some of the ideas here that, all of the domains are connected with each other. And I haven't spoken about the psychomotor side, and it is really important as well, because it's all about development of skills. But seeing them all connected, that's the thing to be doing. And similarly, each one of these tools, whether it be project learning or whether it be the Bloom's cognitive taxonomy, the solo taxonomy, or the affective taxonomy, they're just tools, right? they are a way in which we're to engage and connect and understand, and they provide us with a broader view and help us to construct that, if you like, that scaffold around the building of learning, and be able, most importantly, to be able to provide advice to each one of our students and feel like we're engaging with them. So I guess just a couple of questions that strike me about project learning, which Catherine spoke so well about just a bit earlier, is, how can project-based learning be adapted to your teaching? And how do students organise learning? I mean, it's an important question, particularly now, because we want to be engaged with how they're learning. We want to be engaged and talk more with them about those processes to foster that development of that metacognitive knowledge. Now, in terms of Bloom's cognitive, how many ICT processes can you now map to Bloom's cognitive domain categories? So have a think about that. Make that map. Make those connections and just see how it works, and see if we can plot some of them. And in terms of solo, when we're using it, what was the outcome of your self-assessment when you had a look at it? So go back and have a look at that slide, and just do a little bit of analysis for yourself, and then take it forward. Take it forward for yourself and your colleagues. And in terms of the affective domain, engaging with your students, how might you use Bloom's affective taxonomy to improve remote learning design and engagement? Well, and where next? Well, what's your first, what's your kind of key takeaway from today? How can you try something new? What kind of frameworks are you going to use? What sort of tools do you think you might use? And just remembering that there's a lot out there. There's a lot available. These are just a couple that we've talked about. But the most important principle here being, let's try and engage as far as we possibly can to try and get that feedback coming, so that we can then build more effective engagement with our students. And that's really about all I've got to say just for the moment. But I would love to hear from some of you teachers out there, and perhaps we can get stuck in some questions, Catherine.
Absolutely. Before we do get stuck into some questions, I just want to bring you back to the community of practice that we have for the ICT educators. So on the top, you'll be able to see that there is a website. Join our community. It is free. And within that community, there will be a dedicated forum for you to ask any of these questions. Look out for Webinar 2, Utilising Technology for Remote Learning. I will have the slides available for you, and I know that it is a lot of information to take in for 40 minutes. You've done so well to keep up with us. It means then it'll allow you to unpack, grab the slides from there, and then also continue any conversations or questions that you have that may not be answered within this webinar. We've also got, please contact me and connect with me as well. I'm always looking for educators. You'll be able to find my email address there. And if you have any questions or queries or would like any more support from me, please don't hesitate to contact me. If you're a fan of Twitter, that's my Twitter handle. It's Empower Digitech. Connect with me there. A lot of the times and the posts are always about digital technologies and education. Surprise, surprise. What I also use Twitter for is to push out any new resources that I create within the community of practice as well. Within the community of practice, head over to the Resource Centre, and that's where you will find loads of resources to specifically teach the digital technologies curriculum from foundation to year 10. Now, I am completely aware that different states do use different curriculum. It's not based on the Australian curriculum. We have created resources to support you and your needs as well. So we do have now time for some questions. So if you do have some questions, bring them on in. We'd love to continue this conversation. Now, there was one that did come up, which was all about asking the right question is a skill. Absolutely, I agree with that. Especially when it comes to technology. Any advice to where to start, either with high school or primary schools? Go back and have a look at that Bloom's effective taxonomy. That will be able to help you out to see where your learners are first and where you can take them. What I tend to do with my learners, regardless of where they are, is actually getting them to think about and talk about how they're processing something and their learning behind it as well. As you use those levels as well, you'll be able to work out what type of question is appropriate for where your learner is as well. Phil, I know that there was a question for you that came into, is networking similar to peer review, and is it a good way to obtain feedback? That's a really good question.
Yeah, that's a great question, Catherine. I mean, you know, to start with, networking it offers the opportunity to be able to set up groups of learning. And I think this is the, you know, that and focus on project-based learning. So we're working together like in a community situation. And I think we should be very creative about that. And this is a networking provides, you know, obviously within, you know, we have to be careful about how we construct our linkages with people. But the whole process of networking, I think, and creating groups of knowledge, you know, communities of interaction and communities of learning, through networking, I think is absolutely critical.
Okay, the next question now that we have is how can we apply Bloom's taxonomy to project-based learning, and how can we use experimental theory in an online teaching environment? That's a really great question, and I think that's a little bit of me and a little bit of Phil as well. So I'll start off with is that when you've got project-based learning, you've got a very broad style of activities. What I would suggest then is base the activities that you have within project-based learning on Bloom's. So making sure that you could create a whole project-based learning that may only be at that remembering stage of your learners. So it doesn't really matter how big or how small those learning activities are, making sure that they have that opportunity to analyze, evaluate, and create, making sure that that project has something to do with creating. So as I said before, you could have a whole project-based learning style and all they're doing is sitting at the remembering stage. Phil, is there anything else that you'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, the key message that I get from, you know, the whole effective learning thing, you know, and the stages of going through it, is that what it's doing is mapping a process of, if you like, internalisation and sitting the idea well within a framework. And for a student, that's great because you can observe it. How well are those values? How much is that knowledge being valued? To what level are they applying it? And has it become part of their value system? Because most of the time we want to know, not just whether they can tick off, like you said, remember all these facts, but what can they do with it in terms of a more complex cognitive process? But to make that fit properly, it seems to me that you need the vector, you need the actual application, you need the engagement, you need the motivation. So that's why the valuing kind of measure stick, if you like, the degree to which those ideas are kind of sitting well with the student. And I noticed another question in there. Does it apply to us as well as teachers? Well, of course it does, because if we're not making those connections with the student, we'll soon hear about it. We'll soon see that they're not valuing what we're talking about and those ideas, and it gives us a real great opportunity to better come back and do some more feedback, ask some more questions, set up a different context of the learning, that kind of stuff.
All right, there's another question in here as well. Phil, I'm going to handball this one to you. So we are unable to get exposure to team collaboration in online study, so how to tackle that? As Tuckerman studied on psychology of team, that each team undergoes with 4 stages of forming, norming, storming, and performing. So how to enhance such experience while handling the team project?
Wow. Look, it's
certainly a lot of questions.
Yeah, it's great though, isn't it? I mean, the thing is that the wonderful thing about networked activity is that it can happen in different kind of ways, and so you can get involved in chat groups, you can get involved in building forums. It's all around creativity, and I think this might be the answer to your question here. Look, think about ways in which you can create groups of like-minded people, and then go from there and just see if you can try and apply some of the stuff out of that. I've kind of skirted the question a little bit, I suppose, because I can see it's a charged up question. But look, I really think the most important thing is to start developing some momentum around some of the ideas and getting others to join you in valuing them together, and then just expressing how they can be applied. Because it's not always, things don't always work, in the way you want them to work. And so, but in the meantime, you can be developing something for the right time, for when it is going to be valued and you can make that connection. Is that answering that?
Yeah, I love that answer. Thank you so much, Phil. See, this is why I have Phil on today. So another question is what platforms are available to have virtual classes with children? We are actually going to answer that question in part 2 of this one, where I'm going to get a teacher in and she's going to show you the different platforms that she's used based on the needs of the students as well. So the platform is called IC. I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview into the next webinar. And she's going to take you through how there's different rooms within this virtual platform and how they came in handy for her students to be collaborating online. So we are going to go through more information within that this time next week as well. So you've got to register for that one now to find out that answer.
Yeah, and look, Catherine, I'd just like to add here that, it's really important to contest the idea. That's the important thing here. With the way in which all of these platforms have been, growing exponentially, there's so many of them out in the marketplace. And there's going to be one that suits your learning objectives better than others. And I think that's a really key thing, isn't it, Catherine? Is this whole idea that you started with this whole presentation really nicely, I thought, was kind of, don't focus on the technology, don't let it dominate you. Find out and think about what you're really looking for, and then just get out there and search for it. It's going to be out there.
And the other question that we have within this one is how can we stimulate a busy classroom virtually? That's where the role of you as a teacher will completely change, and the type of questions that you will need to ask as well. The issue with a virtual classroom is that you don't have that feedback that we would normally have when we've got our students face to face. So we actually have to, as educators, try a lot harder to engage our students when we are working online. making sure that whenever they have a question or you then have an answer to it, that you then continue that conversation as well by actually having another question to stimulate more conversation from them. Phil, you'll be able to answer this one as well, is how do you engage your students virtually online when you're working with your PY students?
I think the trick here is one of the key words here is authenticity. And what you really want to do is to be able to actually get them to engage with stuff they want to talk about. Like, what is it that really drives them? What are the things that are interesting them? But not just that, but also to make sure that you're getting proper feedback from them. In other words, give them multiple channels and multiple opportunities. Don't just go, oh, it's all got to be text-based, or it's all got to be just in an assignment, or it's all got to be in a video, or whatever it is. You need to try and encourage as many different ways of getting feedback as you possibly can. So that's the first point, multiple channels. I think the next point is you need to have them going at once. It's like you don't want, you watch some of these younger kids working a phone now. I mean, I used to think I was pretty good with the old Nokia phones and all the rest of it, but now these kids are really able to multitask really well, and I think we've got to provide those kind of opportunities for them. So think about not just using one channel. Think about a range of multiple channels running at the same time.
Another question that came up as well, which is really interesting, is today Twitter announcing that their employees can work from home forever. What do you think the future is for working or learning as more technology companies push for remote learning? Will universities follow that trait? Look, I think when it comes to education, we will always need to have some sort of interaction with us, especially I come from a primary school background, and I know that it's not just about educating and learning that we need. It's not the academic side of it. We're also teaching our students social interaction as well, and that's something that's really important. When it comes to universities and them working online, that happened to me, and I experienced that when I was doing my Masters of Education in Digital Technologies in Education, would you believe? And a lot of it was actually online. One thing that I did crave is that interaction with fellow peers, to be able to have those incidental moments that I had with my lecturer and also my peers. We did, I think out of the 12 weeks, I think we had 2 face-to-face classes, and I just love those ones. So look, there is certainly a place for technology when it does come to remote learning, because it enabled me to just not have to worry about being physically present every single week on campus. However, there was also that other element to it as well, is having those incidental conversations that we do have that kind of spark more conversations. Phil, what do you have to say about this?
Well, look, I just like to throw in one small thing here, and that's this thing that I started with, was this, that we do have a new virtual zone of development going on here, and I think going forward, we're all going to have to be able to accommodate this virtual learning aspect in our lives. I mean, it's there, and it's going to be a constant feeder, and we need to be able to teach and readjust the way in which we are educating. And if it means that we need to take, and I think universities are already doing this, they're starting to think a bit more about a blended approach to things. And I think this is a really smart move going forward. I think all of, and what we're going to get from this whole experience of social restriction is that we're going to start seeing the value in some aspects where we can actually deliver more effectively, in an online environment that we can in any other environment. But that's not to say that we're going to do it all that way. We're not. I think what we need to do, like you're saying, we're still going to need the contact. We still need that, engaged social learning process. But we need to recognise that we're all going to have a journey of our own, which is going to be a virtual one, largely relating to a whole lot of capabilities to do with our competence of engagement with the world of ICT.
I read a really fascinating book, and it was by Neil Selwyn, and it's called Is Technology Good for Education? So he looks at it from an educator's point of view. He was my professor when I was doing my postgraduate, and he looks at all of the different impacts that technology has made on education, and he looks at it from an education point of view as well. He goes through inequality. There's also just how it's developing and changing education as well. If you would like some light reading, it wasn't too bad to read. I actually probably read it over a couple of days. Definitely get your hands on that. That was Neil Selwyn, Is Technology Good for Education? And there is no short answer of yes or no, but he takes you through all the considerations that we have. Now, unfortunately, that is time up for us. Yep. There are so many more questions that I would love to be answering, but unfortunately we don't have time for. Remembering that we do have that forum, and please use it, and please ask some of these questions, because I do log on every day. So if there's anything that you need assistance-wise, please let me know. Now, also remember that we also have more webinars coming up as well. This is an 8-part series, and we're only up to webinar 2. So you can imagine there's so much content to go through. Next week, we're going to be doing part 2 of utilising technology for remote learning. I'm actually going to take you through a couple of evaluation processes and ask you questions and considerations to help you make that right choice when you're picking those right tools. The next one after that, we're going to dive into the digital technologies curriculum, and that's specific for primary school teachers. So if you're a primary school teacher and you're kind of slowly starting to navigate your way through the digital technologies curriculum, you need to be on that webinar as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know that there was a lot of information that we went through. We are recording these sessions, so you can go back and you can look over it again. Thank you so much for your support. And if May 20th interests you and looking at evaluating technology, I will see you next Wednesday.